They mocked her shots at the range, dismissing her as just another civilian contractor, a desk jockey who probably hadn't held a rifle since basic training. They laughed at her awkward grip, her civilian gear that looked more suited for a weekend hike than for combat. But then, Sarah Chun stepped up to the firing line. The sound of her first shot reverberated through the air, sharp, clean, and precise. A perfect miss. It wasn't a failure. Not really. It was the kind of shot that showed focus, control, and intent. But it wasn't enough to silence the mocking voices behind her. They laughed again. A slight adjustment, a shift of her stance. Then another shot. This one hit dead center. And then the next. And the next. Each round landed with surgical precision. The laughter from behind her faded into stunned silence. The instructors, who had mocked her every move, now stood frozen, their eyes wide as Sarah's shots found their mark again and again. It wasn't just the accuracy of her shooting. It was the way she did it. Calm, collected, as though she'd done this 1,000 times before, under far more dangerous conditions. But there was something else, something more, that caught their attention. As she slid off her glove, the faded black ink of a tattoo peeked out from beneath her sleeve. A mark of history, a symbol they recognized but didn't expect to see on someone like her. That was when the visiting SEAL commander froze mid-step. He wasn't surprised by her shooting anymore, but by the tattoo, a mark only earned by those who had walked the darkest paths of covert operations. Want to know what that tattoo really meant, and why the entire range went silent? Stay tuned. The morning heat at Camp Alverston felt like breathing through wet wool, even at 0900 hours. The kind of dry, suffocating heat that made your eyes water and turned every metal surface into a branding iron. The air buzzed with the sound of diesel generators, and the distant hum of Interstate 40 beyond the perimeter fence was a faint reminder that the world outside continued to spin, while inside the wire, the military world moved with its own rhythm. Beyond the gates, the town of Alverston was quiet, normal, but inside the base, every sound was amplified, sharp and clear. It was the kind of place where everything had a purpose. Every footstep, every movement. Nothing went unnoticed. Sarah Chun stepped out of the silver transport van and into the blistering morning air. Her attire was a clear signal. Civilian contractor, a job that had brought her here to the training range. Faded cargo pants that had seen too many wash cycles. A black zip-up jacket that was too light for anyone working outdoors. Tactical sneakers that screamed catalog purchase rather than battle-tested. A laminated temp clearance badge swayed from her left cargo pocket with each step. The badge, a reminder of her status, showed a picture of a woman with shorter hair and darker circles under her eyes. A photo taken back when she still cared about her appearance. But those days were gone. Now, she walked with a practiced, almost mechanical pace, one that suggested she had learned to blend in. Her gaze moved across the compound with quiet precision, taking in every detail. The placement of towers, the positioning of vehicles, potential escape routes. It was the kind of scanning most people did unconsciously, but Sarah did it as a reflex, like someone who'd lived this life for far longer than she cared to admit. It was instinct. Master Sergeant J. Collis stood by the armory shack, arms crossed over his gut, watching Sarah with an expert's eye. His partner, Staff Sergeant Mike Vanek, squinted at her paperwork, a pair of reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, his glory days long gone behind him. The two men exchanged a look, one that spoke volumes. They'd seen contractors before. They'd seen people who showed up wearing civilian gear and made wild assumptions based on their appearance. The look in their eyes was the same. This one's not worth the trouble. She's probably never touched a rifle in her life, Vanek muttered, sliding the file across the table with a dismissive shove. What's she gonna do? Shoot a target with that little bag of hers? Collis snorted. Bet she's here because they needed to check some diversity box, he added, laughing at his own joke, but there was no humor in his voice. It wasn't that they didn't believe in the military. On the contrary, they'd seen combat, fought real battles. But after years of teaching weekend warriors and desk jockeys, they'd grown jaded. Their perception of real operators had narrowed, and in their minds, the line was clear. Military experience meant toughness, and anyone who looked or acted differently didn't belong. Sarah didn't flinch at their comments. She'd heard worse from men who actually knew what they were talking about. Instead, she walked toward the intake desk, where a young corporal barely glanced up from his coffee. "Lane 9, he said in a bored tone, not looking at her face. "Lane 9, Sarah repeated. It was the corner lane, the one no one wanted, the one that made the brass casings roll under the fence and echoed off the concrete barriers in a way that made shooting there feel like a punishment. They stuck the people they wanted to forget about in Lane 9, where the only thing quieter than the trainees were the instructors. Sarah nodded once, adjusting the strap on her kit bag, and made her way down the range. 2 young reservists were already there, too busy cracking jokes about her to notice her approach. $5 says she can't hit the broadside of a barn. One of them whispered loud enough for her to hear. The other laughed. Sarah didn't respond to the taunts. She didn't even look their way. Instead, she set her gear down on the bench at Lane 9, every movement deliberate, like a ritual. Each piece of gear adjusted with the precision of someone who had done this countless times before. Her compact kit bag contained the tools of someone who took shooting seriously. Custom-molded earplugs, soft leather gloves with reinforced fingertips, a small black case with a sight adjustment tool that looked more worn than anything the base armory owned. She wasn't there to show off or to prove anything. The M4 carbine she was assigned was standard issue, worn, with scratched serial numbers and rough, used furniture. The kind of rifle that had seen more rounds than most soldiers would ever fire in their careers. But when Sarah's hands touched the weapon, it was as though she was greeting an old friend. Her fingers moved over it with a familiarity that spoke volumes. Checking the bolt, cleaning, lubricating, adjusting the sling. Everything about the rifle told a story, a history that Sarah could read with a single glance. Behind her, the reservists were still talking. "Bet she's never even held a weapon like that before," one of them said, followed by a snicker. Sarah didn't acknowledge them. She just chambered a round smoothly and settled into her stance. No hesitation. No second-guessing. And then the shooting began. The laughter continued as Sarah set up her gear, the sound of mocking voices echoing in the hot desert air. The reservists, confident in their judgment of the civilian contractor, were more than happy to make her the target of their jokes. "Look at her," one of them whispered loudly, his voice carrying across the line. "Probably hasn't touched a rifle since basic training." The taller of the two, grinning wide, added, "Probably thinks this is like some YouTube tutorial." It was the kind of cruel humor that came easily to young soldiers who had yet to face the real consequences of their arrogance. They laughed at her gear, at the way she held her rifle, and at the deliberate pace with which she checked every piece of equipment. Sarah didn't flinch. She'd heard it all before, from better men, from real operators. Their taunts meant nothing to her. This wasn't her first time at the range. With deliberate calm, she adjusted the sling on the M4, making sure it fit her frame perfectly. Each movement was meticulous, precise, like a well-rehearsed dance. It wasn't about showing off. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was simply about doing what needed to be done, the right way, every time. "Should we give her a hand?" Hollis, one of the instructors, called out, stepping closer to the range. His voice dripped with mockery as he crossed his arms and surveyed her. "Does she need help reading the safety manual?" He snorted, clearly enjoying the chance to belittle her. The reservists laughed again, more to show solidarity than out of genuine amusement. They were sure they had her pegged. She was just another civilian, Another contractor sent here to check a box, to take up space. They had seen it all before. But Sarah didn't react. She didn't even seem to hear their insults. Her focus completely on the rifle in front of her. She wasn't here to argue. She wasn't here to justify herself. The first shot was nothing spectacular. It went wide, just off-center, but still within the acceptable range. It wasn't a miss, but it wasn't a perfect shot either. To the instructors, it looked like exactly what they expected. Someone out of practice, fumbling their way through. She's gonna need a lot more than that to impress us, Vanek muttered under his breath, though his voice carried just enough for Sarah to hear. His eyes narrowed as he watched her, half expecting her to falter. Sarah didn't react. She simply adjusted her stance slightly, the weight shifting ever so slightly forward, and aimed again. The next shot was different. This time, the bullet hit dead center, the hole appearing right in the middle of the target with a kind of precision that could not be faked. The laughter behind her faltered, a brief silence filling the air. But it wasn't enough to stop the mockery. Okay, she's got one good shot, Hollis said, his voice dripping with disbelief. But I'm sure she's going to pull wide again in a minute. Vanek stepped closer, squinting down range at her target, watching as she fired again. This time, the grouping was even tighter. By the third shot, Sarah's shots were within an inch of each other, forming a small cluster in the center of the target. The instructors were no longer laughing. Their smug expressions began to fade, replaced by cautious curiosity. All right, I'll give her that, Hollis said, a little quieter now. But let's see how she does when the pressure's on. Sarah didn't react to the challenge. She was too focused on the task at hand. Her breathing was steady, controlled. Her hands moved with the ease of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times before. Someone who had honed these skills in ways they could never imagine. By the fifth shot, it was clear. The grouping was flawless, tight, consistent, controlled. Sarah wasn't just shooting. She was placing each round with the kind of precision most shooters only dreamed of achieving. And with every shot, the instructors felt their confidence slip away, replaced by the sinking realization that they had underestimated her completely. What the hell? Vanek muttered, leaning in closer to examine the target through his binoculars. This is better than anything I've seen all week. The reserve jokes had stopped, the laughter silenced by the growing tension. Sarah's focus remained unbroken. It wasn't about proving something to anyone. It was about doing her job, the way she had been trained to do. Hollis glanced at Vanek, unsure of what to make of it. This isn't right, he muttered. Who the hell is this woman? Vanek didn't answer. He just stared at the target, the realization slowly dawning that Sarah was no ordinary civilian contractor. The woman shooting at lane 9 was something else entirely. As Sarah fired the seventh shot, each bullet finding its place with almost eerie precision, the range fell completely silent. Even the buzzing of the generator seemed to fade away. The only sound left in the air the sharp crack of her rifle, each shot echoing like a drumbeat in the tense atmosphere. By the eighth shot, Sarah's grouping was tighter than anything either of them could manage, no matter how many years they'd spent on the range. The other shooters, those young reservists who had mocked her just moments before, now stood still, their eyes fixed on the target. What had once been cruel humor was now replaced by a mixture of awe and unease. Sarah didn't look up from her rifle. She didn't need to. The job was simple. Hit the target, repeat. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just doing what she'd done for years. And as the shots continued, she had proven that competence didn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it was quiet, measured, and deliberate. But the instructors weren't laughing anymore. They were watching her closely now, eyes narrowed, trying to figure out just who she was and why she was so damn good. By the seventh shot, Sarah had already proven more than enough to everyone watching. The instructors, who had once mocked her, now stood frozen, watching as she placed shot after shot with a cold, mechanical precision that felt almost unnatural. The shots rang out, crisp and controlled, each round landing exactly where she intended, with no hesitation, no fumbling. The noise from the range became a dull background hum, overshadowed by the sound of the bolts cycling and the slight click of her rifle as she reloaded. She was in the zone, her focus unbroken. Jesus Christ, Hollis muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. He had started the day with a smile and a dismissive attitude, but now he was struggling to comprehend what was happening. He glanced at Vanek, who stood beside him, equally stunned. How the hell is she shooting like that? Vanek, normally the picture of unshakable confidence, squinted at Sarah's target. He had watched her fire from a distance, but seeing the holes on the target up close was a different experience. "She's hitting the center of the bullseye every time," he said quietly, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I've never seen anything like this." The laughter from the reservists was long gone, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. The young men who had once mocked Sarah now watched her every movement, their eyes wide. They could no longer afford to underestimate her. Not after what they just witnessed. Hollis cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of authority. All right. Let's see what you really got," he said loudly, addressing Sarah as she fired another shot. "Let's see if you can really handle that weapon." Sarah didn't respond, didn't even look up. She simply chambered another round, her movements fluid and instinctive. The rifle was an extension of her body, and she was already one step ahead of everyone else. The shot rang out, and the sound echoed off the concrete barriers, sharp and final. Another perfect hit. Another bullet hole dead center in the target. And then another. Each shot seemed to erase any doubts that remained about her skill. The grouping was tighter now, no more than an inch across, with all her shots landing in the exact same place. It was the kind of accuracy that came from years of experience. Experience Sarah wasn't sharing. It wasn't just muscle memory at play. It was something deeper, something that had been carved into her over time, something born from necessity and survival. She had been trained to do this, and more. Vanek, who had been the most skeptical, took a step forward, his hand rubbing the back of his neck. This is beyond what I expected." He leaned in closer, inspecting the target through his binoculars. "She's putting them all within a 2-inch spread. It's perfect." The words hung in the air, and for the first time all morning, there was no mockery in his tone, only awe. Behind Sarah, the younger reservists shifted nervously. The one who had been so vocal earlier, the one who had joked about YouTube tutorials, now stood with his arms crossed, looking down at the ground. His face was flushed with embarrassment. The reality was dawning on him. Sarah wasn't just a civilian contractor who had no place on a military range. She was something else entirely. "She's not just some weekend shooter," one of the reservists murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's a damn professional." Hollis turned to face Vanek, his face pale. "What the hell do we do with this?" His voice was no longer dismissive. It was filled with uncertainty, a crack forming in his normally confident demeanor. "We've been watching her all morning, thinking she's just some civilian, and now—" But before he could finish his thought, Sarah fired her 10th shot. The sound was clean, sharp, and final, the report of the rifle cutting through the still air. Hollis and Vanek exchanged a look. They knew what they had just seen, but the finality of Sarah's grouping, a perfect, tight cluster at the center of the target, seemed to leave them speechless. The group had turned from mockery to disbelief in a matter of minutes. And then, just like that, the range fell completely silent. The only sound now was the methodical rhythm of Sarah's breathing, the slight click of the magazine release, and the soft rustle of her gloves as she reloaded. The once rambunctious reservists had no more words. Their previous bravado had evaporated, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that they had underestimated her from the start. "She's good," Hollis said finally, his voice quieter, filled with reluctant respect. He looked down at the target again, his eyes still lingering on the neat grouping of holes. "Better than most of the active-duty shooters I've seen. Hell, she's better than me." Vanek nodded slowly, still in a state of disbelief. "No doubt about it. But how the hell did she get like this?" His eyes flicked over to Sarah, who was now packing up her gear with the same calm precision. "I don't think she's who she says she is." At that moment, Sarah finished reloading, and without a word, she started to gather her gear. The instructors and the reservists exchanged uneasy glances as they watched her. Sarah didn't look up as she moved, focused entirely on her task. It wasn't arrogance in her movements. It was professionalism. She was simply doing her job, just as she had countless times before. The silence on the range stretched out, thick and heavy. Sarah's shots were perfect, her control over the rifle flawless. She was done, her target a testament to years of expertise. As she lowered her rifle and began the ritual of reloading, she didn't even look up to acknowledge the watching eyes. To her, this was just another day at the range. But for the instructors and the reservists, nothing was the same anymore. They watched her methodically clear her weapon, her movements precise and deliberate, every action a step in a routine that seemed as natural as breathing. But then, as Sarah adjusted her gear, her jacket sleeve shifted, and for just a moment, something caught their eye. The faded ink of a tattoo was visible under her left sleeve. It was small, but there was no mistaking its design. The skull, crossed harpoons beneath it, was unmistakable to anyone who had spent time in the shadows of military operations. Vanek was the first to notice it. His eyes narrowed, disbelief crawling across his face. "Is that?" He didn't finish the sentence. His voice caught in his throat, a feeling of recognition washing over him. He stepped forward, trying to get a better look. The tattoo was subtle, not something that screamed for attention, but there was a gravity to it, something that didn't belong in this civilian contractor's world. Hollis followed his gaze, squinting as the ink became clearer. He frowned, confusion and suspicion working through him. "Is that what I think it is?" he muttered, the words coming out slower than he intended. Before either man could speak again, the sound of boots on gravel interrupted the tense moment. The door to the range opened with a squeal of protesting hinges, and 3 figures stepped into the compound. At first, it seemed like any other official visit. 2 administrative escorts, both stiff in posture, and then the man who dominated the space as soon as he entered. Commander James Mitchell, the kind of man whose presence was felt the moment he walked into the room. He was older than the men on the range, in his late 50s, his silver hair cropped close and military. A scar above his right eyebrow caught the light as he scanned the range, his eyes flicking briefly to the shooters. But then they landed on Sarah. His expression shifted instantly. It wasn't shock, exactly, more like recognition, mixed with something deeper. Something that stopped him in his tracks. "Commander Mitchell," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of something unspoken. The moment he appeared, the air seemed to change. The instructors stood straighter, instinctively, though they didn't know why. Even the reservists seemed to stiffen. The silence that followed his entry wasn't uncomfortable. It was one of those moments when everyone, without thinking, understood the significance of the man's presence. Mitchell's eyes were fixed on Sarah, studying her as she fired again. Another perfect shot. Her grouping was still tight, the rounds falling exactly where she wanted them. It was almost effortless. He smiled to himself, but it wasn't a smile of surprise. It was one of recognition. He walked toward her, his footsteps calm and deliberate, his escorts trailing behind like an afterthought. The instructor straightened up automatically. Hollis, to his own shock, found himself standing at attention without even thinking about it. The younger reservists, still trying to find their footing after the shock of Sarah's shooting, tried to look busy, but all eyes were on the commander now. Sarah didn't turn to acknowledge him, didn't pause in her firing. She continued with her rhythm, like she was used to this kind of attention. Still shooting with that inside shoulder bias? Mitchell asked, his voice low but just loud enough for her to hear. Sarah's body froze, not stiffly, but in a way that showed she was now fully aware of his presence. For the first time since arriving at Camp Alverston, her carefully maintained composure cracked just slightly. It wasn't fear that showed on her face. It was recognition, the look of someone seeing a ghost from a past life. She turned slowly to face him, the air between them heavy with history, with memories of a time Sarah had thought she had left behind. "Commander Mitchell," Sarah said again, her voice controlled, though there was a flicker of something raw in her gaze. "It's been a long time." He smiled, a soft expression that seemed almost paternal. "Didn't expect to find you here. Last I heard, you disappeared completely into the civilian world." Sarah's response was casual, almost dismissive. "I needed to requalify. Contractors are required to have current scores." She paused for just a moment, and then added, "For what?" Mitchell glanced at the instructors, whose eyes were shifting from Sarah to him. He knew they had no idea what was happening, what Sarah had been, what she had done, what she was. "Sarah here trained our Overwatch specialist for 7 years, Mitchell said, his voice taking on a tone of weight, as if he were delivering a briefing. "Back when we were still figuring out what Overwatch really meant in asymmetric warfare." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the range was completely still. Even the instructors, who had spent all morning mocking Sarah, now stood speechless, staring at her with a mix of disbelief and confusion. Mitchell continued. "She taught long-range suppression from canopy positions, urban hide construction, target identification without a spotter, no drone assist, no real-time intelligence. Just patience and precision." The words felt like a slap in the face to the instructors. They had been laughing at Sarah, mocking her, thinking she was just some contractor who didn't belong on a military range. But now, in the presence of someone who clearly knew her past, the full gravity of the situation hit them. The commander's gaze softened, acknowledging the depth of what he was saying. "That tattoo on her arm," he added, his voice quiet but carrying. "It's not something you pick up at any tattoo parlor. It's a mark of someone who earned it through blood. That's a Black Echo tattoo. It's hand-inked by the unit armorer using traditional methods. And they only gave that ink to those who completed 2 or more off-grid recoveries." Mitchell turned to the instructors, his voice unwavering. "You know what happened at 7 Trees?" Hollis didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stared at Sarah, the pieces falling into place. Suddenly, everything about her made sense, even her deliberate calm under pressure. The commander's words hit like a wave, one that would change everything. But before anyone could speak again, he turned back to Sarah. "You still carrying that old ink?" he asked quietly. Sarah looked down at her arm, where the tattoo now sat visible under her sleeve. "Some things you don't get to leave behind," she said, her voice soft but firm. The sound of boots on gravel signaled a change in the air. It wasn't just the arrival of any officer. It was Commander James Mitchell, a man whose presence demanded attention, a man who had seen more combat than most could ever imagine. He stepped through the gate, flanked by 2 administrative escorts who were so unremarkable in comparison that they might as well have been ghosts. But it was the commander who stood out, his very presence shifting the atmosphere around him. Mitchell was in his late 50s, silver threading through his close-cropped hair. His uniform, though regulation, showed the wear of someone who had been through the field time and again. Softened fabric from too many washings, scuffed boots that spoke of real, on-the-ground use. His face, rugged and weathered by time, held a scar above his right eyebrow, catching the light as he surveyed the range. For the first time since Sarah had stepped onto the line, the instructor straightened. Hollis, who had been leaning casually against the armory shack, suddenly snapped to attention, his body stiffening without thinking. Vanek followed suit, his posture tight with respect. There was something in the air now, an unspoken acknowledgement that Commander Mitchell was someone who commanded respect, not through rank alone, but through reputation. Mitchell scanned the range, his eyes moving from shooter to shooter, but then they landed on Sarah. His gaze was steady, unflinching. It wasn't surprise that flickered across his face. It was something deeper. Recognition. It was as though the presence of Sarah at this range, in this moment, had stirred something long buried, a connection to a past neither of them had fully left behind. The instructors exchanged uneasy glances, none of them quite sure what to make of the situation. They had spent the morning mocking Sarah, underestimating her, judging her based on her civilian appearance, and the assumption that she wasn't qualified for the kind of work that happened at Camp Alverston. But now, standing just a few yards away from them, was someone who clearly knew Sarah, and the recognition in his eyes was anything but casual. Commander Mitchell walked towards Sarah, his footsteps slow, deliberate. It was clear he wasn't in a rush, and his measured pace only added to the weight of the moment. Sarah, for her part, didn't flinch. She didn't look up or acknowledge his approach. She didn't need to. The past they shared was something more than words could express. And in that moment, everything else on the range seemed irrelevant. The two men who had so confidently mocked Sarah just moments before stood still, unsure of what to do next. They had seen this woman shoot. They had seen the tattoo on her arm. And now, seeing Mitchell walk toward her, they were confronted with the realization that they were in the presence of someone they had grossly misjudged. Mitchell stopped beside Sarah without a word, his gaze shifting from her to the target she had just obliterated with pinpoint accuracy. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He simply observed her. "Still shooting with that inside shoulder bias?" he asked quietly, his voice barely rising above the ambient noise of the range. It was a familiar tone, one that spoke of history between them, of something unspoken but understood. Sarah, still holding the rifle in her hands, paused mid-reload. She didn't look at him immediately. Instead, her eyes flicked to the target, her face betraying the slightest hint of recognition. She was calm, collected, but there was a shift in her demeanor as the commander's words settled in. It wasn't fear that showed in her eyes. It was a guarded recognition, the kind of feeling you get when you unexpectedly see someone from your past, someone who knows things about you that you've worked hard to forget. Sarah turned slowly, facing Mitchell for the first time since he had entered the range. "Commander Mitchell," she said, her voice steady, though there was something vulnerable in the way she spoke his name. "It's been a long time." Mitchell's expression softened for a moment, a slight smile crossing his face, as though he had expected to find Sarah here, in this moment, in this place. "Didn't expect to find you here," he said, his tone gentle but filled with an underlying warmth. "Last I heard, you disappeared completely into the civilian world." Sarah didn't immediately respond. She didn't have to. Her actions spoke louder than words. She was the same woman who had carried out impossible missions, the same woman who had disappeared from the military world to live a quieter life. But that past was never as far away as it seemed. Not to Mitchell. Not to Sarah. "I needed to requalify," she said simply, her tone almost dismissive, as if the explanation was enough. She gestured vaguely at her civilian attire, the temp clearance badge clipped to her pants. "Contractors require current scores." Mitchell didn't press further. He knew better than to ask for more. He had seen Sarah in action before. He knew what she was capable of. And even now, as they stood in the quiet hum of the range, he knew that the past they had shared was something both of them had buried for good reason. But the tattoo, his gaze drifted to her exposed wrist again. was a reminder that some things couldn't be hidden forever. He turned to the instructors, who were still trying to come to terms with the situation. They had been so quick to judge, so eager to dismiss Sarah. Now they were faced with the reality of her skill, her past, and the unmistakable mark on her wrist that no one could ignore. Mitchell's voice carried across the silence. "Sarah here trained our Overwatch specialist for 7 years," he said, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. "Back when we were still figuring out what Overwatch really meant in asymmetric warfare." The instructors stood frozen, their mouths agape as Mitchell continued. "She taught long-range suppression from canopy positions, target identification without the help of drones, and the kind of patience it takes to get a shot that makes every bullet count." And then, as if to seal their fate, Mitchell added, "That tattoo? It's not decoration. It's a mark of someone who earned it through blood. Someone who has seen and done things you can't even begin to imagine." The range was silent, the air thick with the weight of revelation. The tension that had been building since Sarah first stepped onto the line was now palpable. Everyone was listening to Commander Mitchell, his voice steady, each word calculated to land with the gravity of years of experience. Sarah stood to the side, her hands still working mechanically to reload her rifle, as though the world had stopped but she remained fixed in her task. Her movements were deliberate, unaffected by the mounting tension around her. Mitchell's eyes scanned the range, briefly glancing at the instructors, who were now hanging on every word. They had spent the morning laughing at Sarah, dismissing her as just another civilian contractor. Now, they were beginning to realize that they had underestimated her on a scale they hadn't imagined possible. "She's not just any contractor," Mitchell continued, his voice steady but carrying the weight of something more significant than military rank. "Sarah was part of one of the most classified operations in the history of modern warfare. Black Echo." At the mention of the name, the instructors stiffened, their expressions transforming from confusion to something more akin to recognition. The room seemed to freeze, the words hanging in the air like a sudden gust of wind. Vanek, who had been silently watching Sarah all morning, finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Black Echo. I've heard rumors, but I thought it was just stories. Is that really what this is about?" Mitchell turned to face him, his gaze direct. "Black Echo is as real as the rifle you're holding. It was a program designed for one purpose: to train the most elite operators in the world, the kind of people who could infiltrate enemy territory, make impossible shots, and return without leaving a trace." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. He could see the disbelief in their eyes, the way they struggled to comprehend the implications of what he was saying. "Sarah trained the Overwatch specialists for 7 years," Mitchell continued, his voice softer now, almost respectful. "She wasn't just a trainer. She was a part of the program herself. Back when we were still figuring out what Overwatch really meant in the world of asymmetric warfare." The instructors exchanged glances, their earlier bravado slipping away with every word. They had assumed Sarah was just another civilian with little to no real experience. But now they were hearing about a woman who had worked with some of the most covert operatives in history, a woman whose training had helped shape the very tactics they were trying to teach. "What kind of person does that?" Hollis asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Who goes through something like that, and then just disappears into civilian life?" Mitchell's gaze softened, as if he understood the question in a way that Hollis couldn't. "It's not about disappearing, Hollis. It's about survival. Sarah was one of the best. She didn't just teach. She lived it. She performed off-grid recoveries, identified targets in civilian populations, worked without a spotter, without drones, without the resources most soldiers get. Just patience, precision, and instinct." Sarah didn't look up as Mitchell spoke. She didn't need to. Her past was something she had buried long ago. But now, with every word, it was rising to the surface once more. She was a part of something that most people couldn't even fathom. Black Echo wasn't just a name. It was a legacy, one that she carried quietly, without seeking recognition. But Mitchell's words were forcing the world to acknowledge what she had done, and who she truly was. They trained for the impossible, Mitchell continued, his voice steady and matter-of-fact. No backup, no intelligence, just raw skill and the will to survive. Sarah was part of that. She worked in conditions that would make most people break, but not her. She had to be perfect. The stakes were too high. Hollis and Vanek stood still, processing the information. They had spent the entire morning mocking Sarah, laughing at her civilian gear, at her calm demeanor, at the way she had walked into their world like it was no big deal. But now, the story unfolding in front of them seemed like something out of a movie, not a reality they had ever considered. "She did one of the most impossible extractions I've ever witnessed," Mitchell said, his voice taking on a somber tone. "The mission at 7 Trees. 12 contractors were trapped behind enemy lines. The Pentagon had already written them off. They had no hope, no air support, no way to get to them. But Sarah, against orders, decided she couldn't leave them to die." There was a pause in the conversation, and for a brief moment, the only sound in the room was the hum of the air conditioning units fighting the heat. The instructors stood in stunned silence as Mitchell's words hung in the air, the weight of them settling on their shoulders. 7 Trees, Mitchell repeated, his eyes locking with Sarah's for the first time since the revelation began. She carried a 40-pound pack, ammunition, a medical kit, and a sense of duty that I still can't understand. She moved through sandstorms and enemy territory for 14 hours, retrieving those contractors, saving their lives one by one. No casualties on our side. The silence in the room was deafening. The range, which had been filled with laughter and mockery just hours earlier, was now still. No one spoke, no one moved. They were all too caught up in the gravity of the situation, in the realization that they had been so wrong about Sarah. Mitchell looked around at the instructors, his eyes steady. The only evidence she'd been there were the 37 enemy combatants she eliminated to clear their path. Those contractors? They never saw her face. They just knew that death was coming for them. And then something even more dangerous came for death. That's the kind of person Sarah is. That's the kind of work she did. He turned back to Sarah, his expression softening. Some things you can't leave behind. Some things follow you for the rest of your life, whether you want them to or not. Sarah finally met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "It wasn't about the mission," she said, her voice quiet. "It was about the people I saved. That's all." Mitchell nodded slowly, understanding. He had been there, in the trenches with Sarah, and he knew exactly what she meant. The words Mitchell had spoken still hung in the air, reverberating through the stillness of the range. The instructors and reservists stood in uneasy silence, still processing the weight of Sarah's past, her accomplishments, and the life she had led in the shadows. The buzz of the generators, the distant hum of base traffic, all of it felt far away, as if the world had paused to allow the moment to sink in. Sarah stood motionless, her eyes briefly closing as if she were blocking out the world. Her hands rested on her rifle, the familiar weight of the weapon comforting despite the tension that clung to the air. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected the truth to surface, to be dragged back into the light. It had been years since she'd left that world behind, but now the past seemed to rush back in, filling the spaces between the present and the future she had built for herself. Mitchell's eyes softened as he watched her. He knew what this moment meant to Sarah. He knew the toll that kind of life took on a person. To be a part of Black Echo, to live a life where survival was the only rule, meant living with things that most people would never understand. It meant carrying scars, both seen and unseen, that couldn't be washed away with time. "Some things you can't leave behind," Mitchell said quietly, his voice holding a quiet understanding that only years of shared experience could bring. Not the memories, not the missions. They stick with you, whether you want them to or not. Sarah didn't respond at first. Instead, she bent down, gathering her gear with slow, methodical movements. Her face was unreadable, but the tension in her shoulders told the story. She had carried the weight of her past for years, hiding it behind the walls she had built. And now, those walls were beginning to crack. She wasn't sure how to feel about that, about being seen again, about the past she had tried so hard to bury coming back to haunt her. "You know," Sarah said, her voice low, almost to herself, "there's not a day that goes by I don't remember that mission. 7 trees. It wasn't just about the contractors I saved. It was about something bigger, something I could never explain to anyone who wasn't there. But that's the thing about silence. It doesn't go away. It just gets louder the longer you ignore it." Mitchell nodded, his gaze steady. "I know, Sarah. I know." His voice was gentle, but there was an edge of something darker there, a knowing. You did something most people couldn't even imagine. You saved lives when the world had written them off. But it comes at a price. Sarah's hands paused as she packed her kit, her fingers lingering over the leather straps of her gloves. The weight of the rifle in her hands felt different now. It wasn't just a tool. It was a reminder of the work she had done, of the sacrifices she had made, of the parts of herself she had left behind. "I left that life behind," she said, her voice firmer now, as if making a decision in the moment. "I don't need to carry that anymore. I don't need to prove anything, not to anyone." Commander Mitchell studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing in understanding. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," he said, his tone more authoritative now. "But you also don't have to hide who you are. You've done things most people will never even know about. And for what? To disappear into the background? To become invisible?" Sarah looked up at him then, the quiet intensity in her gaze unmistakable. "I'm not invisible. I've just learned to keep my head down, to stay out of sight." Mitchell nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer before he turned back to the instructors. Sometimes the most dangerous people in the world are the ones who prefer to remain unseen, the ones who don't need recognition, the ones who do what needs to be done, regardless of the cost. He turned back to Sarah, his voice softer now. "The world may never know what you've done, but I do, and so do the people whose lives you saved." Sarah didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her gaze softened as she packed her bag, her movements slow but sure. She wasn't looking for accolades. She wasn't looking for anyone's respect. But she had earned something more valuable: peace, in the quiet understanding between two people who had seen the worst of what the world could offer. As Sarah stood up, adjusting the strap on her bag, she turned to face the instructors, who were still standing in stunned silence. The younger reservists, who had once mocked her, now watched her with a mixture of awe and respect, though they hadn't yet fully grasped what had just happened. The instructors, too, seemed lost in thought, unsure of how to react. But the moment had passed, and in its place was an uncomfortable realization that some things, some people, were far more than they appeared. Sarah took a deep breath, adjusting her jacket. "I'll see you around," she said, her voice steady, but with a finality that made it clear she was done here. And with that, she turned and walked away, her steps measured, purposeful. The range, once filled with mockery and tension, now stood in silence, an eerie quiet that echoed long after she had disappeared from view.